Guys, good morning and apologies for the delay. It's it's freezing for a start. So what was I going to say? Yeah, so apologies for the delay. Just had a little bit of a tech issue there. My camera decided it wasn't going to turn on, so I said I'd get it sorted before I go live. Okay, guys, thanks for joining. My name is Andy. I am the clinical lead here at Medicare. Oversee all the kind of data science and publications, type of stuff. In this morning's podcast, what we're going to talk about is what parts of your cholesterol matter, why did we fear cholesterol for as long as we did, and why not every doctor, I'm trying to be careful how I say this. Okay, I'll say it as it is. The vast majority of doctors, like 95% plus, in my modest, humble opinion, I might be wrong, will refer to cholesterol through the lens of, not incorrectly, just through the lens of the old paradigm that said, cholesterol equals bad and you should lower your cholesterol. We'll look at why there's some advice to the contrary, lots of advice to the contrary on this. I don't know if anyone saw it or if anyone listening watches the Joe Rogan podcast, but if you're interested in this cholesterol side of things, definitely have a look at the Dr. Sean Baker interview, where he talks through why we feared cholesterol and red meat for so long, why the science has shown exactly to the contrary, and a really interesting research study which is showing that people with the preliminary data shows 95% of people who have otherwise good metabolic health, and by that I mean low blood sugar level, normal blood sugar levels, they're not diabetic, they don't have high blood pressure or a ton of weight around the midsection, with high cholesterol levels, so everything else looks fine, but the very high cholesterol levels have no heart disease. That's a study that will be published on the 8th of December. I can't remember the name of the author offhand. Okay, let me share a couple of slides here for a second. And just to give you a little bit of background in case you haven't heard from me before, this is kind of what we do. We do publications on everything from cardiometabolic health, which is heart disease, cholesterol, diabetes, fatty liver, sleep apnea, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and so on, blood pressure and so on. And we're pretty good at it. So we've won international awards for our publications, as well as the Clinical Pharmacy Congress Award for our work with patients in the NHS. It was the overall winner of excellence in general health. So I show you those not to show off, but merely just to say, look, I know some of the advice I give, some of the stuff, not advice, but some of the content I cover will be somewhat counterintuitive. So bear that in mind. So look, we have, just as a little bit of background, actually, interestingly, on that podcast last night, Dr. Sean Baker was saying that the initial idea that dietary cholesterol, so eggs and cheese and cream and butter, might be bad for your heart, comes from a study on, believe it or not, and this is how these things get started and catch fire, so to speak, on rabbits. So they fed rabbits, I think, a high cholesterol diet for, 4, 5, 6 months, and they started developing heart disease. So that much was true. Cholesterol does cause heart disease, it appears, which is very useful information if you're a rabbit. Now, if you're a human, it's not all that applicable to us, in the same way that you wouldn't put humans on a diet of lettuce only and say, well, they started, their muscles started wasting and atrophying and they died actually 6 months into the study. Therefore, lettuce is bad for you. That's just not the way. It's much more nuanced than that. And although there are things that can transpose over from animal studies to humans and will generally be the same sort of outcome. You see this in mice quite a bit, actually. Interestingly enough, mice would have similar enough physiology to humans in that what you see in mice will, broadly speaking, transfer into humans if the study is done right. So where did we get the idea cholesterol was bad for you? Well, that first study was part of the process, was part of the story, where they put rabbits on a high cholesterol diet and they developed heart disease. The next proponent of saturated fat and cholesterol being bad was a guy called Ansel Keys, who was actually a marine biologist, so a fish biologist, back in the 70s, initially in the late 50s, after trying to remember the president's name. I think it might have been Eisenhower, had a big heart attack and almost died from it. And Eisenhower was just gung-ho after, we need to figure out what causes heart disease. Ansel Keys had an idea at the time. This is the marine biologist. You can look him up. He's the guy who really pushed cholesterol might be clogging up your arteries. And with his kind of notion, and I say notion intentionally because it was the lipid heart hypothesis. That's what it's still called to this day because they never proved it. And it's been disproven since, actually. He said eating dietary cholesterol and saturated fat appears to increase your risk of heart disease. Not that it causes it, not that here's the mechanisms, not let me explain the pathophysiology, just it might be, And he published a study called the 7-country study, where he showed the more saturated fat and cholesterol you eat, the higher your risk of heart disease and the more likely you are to die of heart disease. So you think, if you don't understand how research works, you might go, well, case closed. The countries that eat the most saturated fat get the most heart health. But they were all westernized countries that had loads of sugar and alcohol and smoking and processed food and refined foods as a general rule, likely to be taking more class A drugs and so on and so forth. Now, when you looked at the non-Western countries, the remote tribes around the world, no such correlation existed. Now, interestingly, you would think, God, it was unfortunate that he only picked the 7 countries that showed the connection between saturated fat and cholesterol consumption and heart disease. But he didn't. If you read the story, he had 21 countries in his study, and he very, very disingenuously wanted to fit his own narrative. So he said, look, there are 15 countries here. Clearly, I'm good at science, not good at maths. 14 countries here that don't show a correlation between saturated fat and cholesterol and heart disease. So they're eating loads of eggs and cream and cheese and butter and red meat, but they're getting no heart disease. So we'll just cross those off. We'll just call those outliers, because it suited his narrative, the line of thought that he was onto, to say that cholesterol and saturated fat was the enemy. And he picked the countries like Ireland, like Germany, like France, the westernized countries that had loads of processed food. And by the way, there is no study that says a group of people ate nothing else but a high saturated fat diet and they ruled out everything else. You can't allow for what they call confounding variables. This is the problem with epidemiological or connection-based research, because if you look at 100,000 people over 30 years, you cannot find a group of, more than a couple of hundred people who eat nothing but meat and fat. You'd be looking at a remote tribe. So we're saying, and this is where it gets really squirrely and really kind of colluded and biased. It's disgusting, actually, the way they do research. But you can look at the 100,000 people who ate high amounts of saturated fat and red meat and go, obviously, if they got more heart disease, that's what it was. But you're not asking the question, and this is true, they actually include red meat lasagna. Okay, he ate red meat today. He had pepperoni on his pizza. He ate red meat today. He was also eating pizza and lasagna and sugary stuff and taking drugs and not exercising and drinking loads of alcohol. So was it the cholesterol and the saturated fat, or are we just making a connection that suits the narrative? And anyone with a sciencey brain and who understands nutritional research and epidemiology would say for sure the latter. So we look at cholesterol and we say, well, when you open the arteries, this is very important to know. When you open the arteries of somebody who has a heart attack, the artery will look like this. You cut down cross section of the artery and it will have cholesterol in here, in what's known as the subentima. Now, the subentima is, a lot of people think that it's actually in the artery here. It's kind of stuck to the wall and you might be able to clear it out, but it's actually not. It's gone into this layer here. It's buried in this layer here. And so it's the outer layer, and then you've just got a bulge. So it's not, the cholesterol isn't actually in the artery, really. It's kind of around the artery and causing the artery to bulge. It's in behind what's called the subentima, the first layer. So you might say, well, when you open the arteries of anyone who's had a heart attack, you see this big buildup of cholesterol. Therefore, cholesterol is the problem, which is kind of like saying somebody who's got a bladder that's about to burst has loads of water in it. Therefore, water is the problem. And that's just not the case. It's not how the human body works. The human body is more than capable of maintaining what's called homeostasis, so balancing off cholesterol levels. So if your cholesterol is a little bit on the high side and you say, well, I'm going to eat 12 eggs a day instead of none, it will make no difference to the amount of cholesterol that ends up in your bloodstream. None. Your liver will just downregulate how much it produces. So your liver is like a machine that says, I'm making, the numbers around 2,200 milligrams. I make 2,200 milligrams of cholesterol today. You just ate 1,800. Now I need to make 400. It doesn't just say, we're just going to clog it all up into your arteries. That's not how it works. Okay, so what we've done is we've opened up the arteries. I say we collectively, but heart surgeons open up the arteries and they say cholesterol is there. Therefore, you should probably eat less cholesterol, which is kind of like blaming someone who was there to repair something for causing the damage, which is not the case. So cholesterol's job is to repair sites of what we call insults within your arteries, kind of like little nicks. Think of it as bleeds or cuts. So you wouldn't look at a cut and go, the scab clearly caused the cut because it's there. It makes no sense. What caused the cut is the question. So the graphic here is just kind of making the analogy, and you'd hear a lot of guys in the science world making this analogy who know their stuff about cholesterol. Would you arrest the firefighters at the scene of a fire because they're always there whenever we go to a fire? Of course you would. And again, this is just on the point there that your liver makes 80% of me. Why are you blaming me, the food, when your liver is actually making 80% of your cholesterol? So it's not uncommon for us at all, actually, for us to come across vegans, vegetarians who have very high levels of heart disease, very high plaque buildup, who are eating no cholesterol at all. Because your dietary intake of cholesterol, and this is an important term, does not adversely affect your blood serum cholesterol levels. So I'm not saying it has no effect. It actually has a positive effect a lot of the time, especially if you're eating low sugar or low carb, but it certainly doesn't have a bad effect. So let's get that notion out of here that, cholesterol is bad. If you eat it, it clogs up your arteries. That's definitely not the case. And also, if you have high cholesterol levels, you're going to have a heart attack. Now, this is really important. And I want anyone listening today or anyone watching this back to understand two things from today's session. One, a high total cholesterol is more often than not inversely associated with risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, most doctors will say your cholesterol is over 5, you need to go on a statin, which is a cholesterol lowering medication like atorvastatin, rovastatin, rosuvastatin, there's loads of them, to lower your cholesterol. And I had this conversation with my doctor. I'd say my doctor hates me, but I had this conversation with my doctor, and he said to me, I was in for something totally different, actually, long COVID symptoms. And he said to me, your bloods look remarkably healthy. He came to the last page and he said, oh, but your cholesterol is high. And I said, when you say my cholesterol is high, what are you talking about? Are you talking about my total cholesterol? He said, yeah, it's 6.8. And I said, so? And he said, well, you might want to lower that. And I said, why? And he said, well, to reduce your risk of heart disease. And I said, what about lowering my total cholesterol? Not talking about the numbers below. What about lowering my total cholesterol makes you believe that it would reduce my risk of heart disease? And I didn't phrase it in such a smart ass way. I was trying to be respectful. And he kind of just loosely referred to, oh, if your cholesterol is over 5, it increases your risk of heart disease. And so what are the publications that point to that? I'd like to look them up. And health science is my background. He just kind of like, they're the guidelines. I'm not really sure about the research. And I said, okay. So my HDL is 2.8. My triglycerides are 1.12. So HDL is high, triglycerides are low, which is the good sort of balance you'd like to see in people who are insulin sensitive and have no metabolic health diseases. And LDL and total cholesterol in all of the literature of the last number of years have been anti-correlated with risk of heart disease. So can you just point me to any bit of literature that says I should lower my cholesterol instead of focusing on my HDL and triglycerides, which we know are more than predictive? And he said to me, and I quote, look, I'm going to be honest, I don't really know the ins and outs of it, but if your cholesterol is over 5, our protocol is that we have to put people on a statin. That's it. His words, look, I don't really know. So at the first bit of questioning, the whole deck of cards came down. The whole deck of cards came down. Now, to be fair to him, I won't name him, but he's a good guy, actually, because he said to me, look, we had a big chat actually for about a half an hour. He said, this is really fascinating, actually, that, all the literature that shows the HDL up, triglycerides down being really predictive, total and LDL cholesterol not really being predictive. Can you send me on an email with like 5 or 6 papers or whatever you know off the top of your head? And so I sent him on a big email. So he's a good guy, but it was just, it was floored. I was expecting some sort of a little bit of back and forth or, yeah, but the old school literature showed this. It was just nothing. And again, this is not I'm not trying to slate anyone or any profession. I have huge respect for doctors. And like a friend of mine said to me, I said to him, how can you not know, Paul is his name, he's a doctor. And I said, Paul, how can you not know HDL high, triglycerides low is the main thing to look at in your lipid profile? And he said, well, because I have 70 patients a week, I have 6 to 8 minutes with each of them. There's a waiting room full of people, and I'm working 80 hours a week, and I have to know everything from a fungal toe to a rare cancer. I have to be able to spot the symptoms of those. I'm not going home reading up research papers over the last 5 or 6 years, which is a fair point. It's absolutely a fair point. Okay, so this is the paper showing 75% of patients hospitalized for a heart attack had cholesterol levels in the quote unquote normal range, because the old school normal range would say if your cholesterol is under 5, you're fine. So again, underneath here, specifically, these patients had low density lipoprotein. We used to call that bad cholesterol, that met current guidelines. And close to half of people who had a heart attack had LDL or bad, quote unquote, bad cholesterol levels in the guidelines classified as optimal, really, really low. So 75% of people who had heart attacks that were fatal, that died from heart attacks, had normal total cholesterols and LDL levels. There's an anti-correlation. The higher it is, the lower your risk, which most doctors would think you're bananas if you said that to. But there you go. That's how the science changes. Again, this is another paper showing, basically, I won't go into it too much because it's a little bit nerdy, but LDL cholesterol stands for low density lipoprotein, which is bad cholesterol, is inversely associated with, so the higher it goes, the longer you live. Inversely associated with all-cause mortality, which is wild because most people would tell you LDL is bad cholesterol, which is nonsense. And the higher it goes, the higher your risk of certainly heart disease. And now we've shown that actually the opposite is true. Now, I'm going to just explain what this sentence means here because it's not obvious if you're not into health sciences. This is Professor Thomas Dayspring, who's probably the world's leading experts in lipidology, which is the interpretation of cholesterol numbers, and cardiovascular education as well. He's the director of cardiovascular education for some group in the States. So what he said is current NHANES is just a massive body of data, numbers from patients, it's in the millions, I think, or hundreds of thousands, shows the majority of MIs, heart attacks, myocardial infarctions, are due to insulin resistance, are due to high blood sugar levels, not cholesterol, not saturated fat. And the real message is, unless LDL is over 5.3, unless it's absolutely through the roof. Now, an LDL of 5.3 would mean that your total number that the doctor quotes you would be 11 or 12. It's off the charts high. Unless LDL is 5.3 and your total cholesterol is about 10 or 11, LDL and total cholesterol are terrible biomarkers. What we should really be looking at is HDL and triglycerides. Okay, and this is just a little review of fatty acid rich foods, saturated fatty acid rich foods. So these are your kind of butter, cream, cheese, eggs, red meat, fatty meats, and this includes cream. This pouring cream into your coffee, cooking your fatty ribeye steak in lard or Kerrygold butter, doesn't matter. Several foods that are rich in fatty acids, including, now this is really important, whole fat dairy. Whole fat dairy means cream, butter, cheese, eggs, all that. Whole fat dairy, dark chocolate, unprocessed meat. So fatty red meats, it's saying unprocessed because people still have this hang up about processed foods, processed meats, I should say. So that's red meat, are not associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And you might think, well, who are these guys? This is the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. This is the most highly reputed heart experts in the world. Yet on the other side, you have the World Health Organization saying red meat might be a carcinogen, eggs might increase your risk of diabetes. And if you want to know why that is, look into who funds it. Look into who's on their board of advisors. 3 out of 4 of the main guys are vegans. So that's more a religious ideology than actually caring about your health, in my opinion. This is the guidelines that Dr. Sean Baker was referring to on the podcast last night on Joe Rogan. If anyone is interested in watching that, you'd hear him talking about a lot of the same stuff that I'm talking about. I've learned a lot from him actually over the years, him and lots of other doctors. Talking about the Joe Rogan podcast, by the way, is on Spotify, if you're on Spotify. So as a result, the 2015 to 2020 dietary guidelines for Americans have removed the recommendations of restricting your cholesterol to 300 milligrams a day. So basically, they said the literature regarding dietary cholesterol intake and heart disease has shown there's no evidence at all for concluding that eating cholesterol clogs up your arteries. None at all. So this is the USDA guidelines. So this, you should only eat 1 egg a day or 3 eggs a week. This is just nonsense. It's not supported by any objective empirical literature at all. This is interesting. So we have remote tribes around the world that eat colossal amounts of the stuff that's apparently going to kill us, including red meat, saturated fat, eggs, butter, cream, internal organs, fat from inside the animal, all that sort of stuff. They have no heart disease. And it's not because they're exercising loads. I mean, if you were eating pizzas and cookies and Ben and Jerry's all day long, you wouldn't say, oh, I'm fine because I'm exercising loads. I'm not going to get heart disease. That's just a sort of a throwaway comment for someone who's trying to, I suppose, trying to overcome a bias that they have, that red meat and saturated fat are bad, yet they can't explain how these remote tribes around the world don't get these chronic cardiac diseases. Interestingly, they tend to have very high total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, up over kind of 7, 8, 9, but they have no heart disease. All right, so here's the thing you need to know when it comes to cholesterol. And if you understand this, you will be so well educated around cholesterol if you can repeat it back to your doctor when your doctor says to you, your cholesterol is 6, you should be worried. You'll be able to, spend your own and at least be very well informed, so you can have an informed discussion and make a patient-led shared decision. We refer to it as shared decision making. So HDL, your cholesterol, by the way, is made up of 3 different parts. Now, people say you have good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. There's no such thing as good and bad cholesterol. There is only cholesterol, and then you have cholesterol carriers. So people refer to them loosely as good cholesterol as HDL. HDL is a high-density lipoprotein. Lipo meaning fat, like liposuction, and protein. It's a kind of a part fat, part protein molecule that carries cholesterol. There's only one type of cholesterol. So this is the good carrier. And when this number is high, broadly speaking, you have good health. So a HDL should be above 1.3 at a minimum, and above 1.5 is excellent. Your triglycerides should be below 1.8 and below 1 is excellent. So the absolute optimum you want is a HDL above 1.5 and a triglycerides below 1. At a minimum, you want your HDL cholesterol to be above 1.3 and your triglycerides to be below 1.8 or 2. Now, what is it that will allow us to get these really good numbers? Nothing to do with fat, interestingly, nothing. More to do with your blood sugar levels. If you have good blood sugar control because you're eating less sugar, processed refined carbohydrates, granola bars, pizza, cereals, all that kind of beigey type food that we've all been brought up on, your blood sugar levels will be lower. And that's crucial because it brings on a hormone called insulin. Now, what insulin does is it causes your good cholesterol to go up, wrong hands, causes your good cholesterol to go up and your triglycerides to go down, which is exactly what you want to see to have a good, what we call cholesterol profile or lipid profile. So these are the numbers we want to look for. So HDL, this is bad news if you see this in your cholesterol profile. If you see your good cholesterol is below 1.3 millimoles and your triglycerides are up over 1.8 or around 2. And I see this, it's so predictable. So if I see, and this is not a judgment call at all, but if I'm doing a health assessment out on corporate level like we do, and someone comes in, they have a lot of weight around the midsection, I take their blood pressure, and it's high, predictably. And I can tell when they come in, I could put the house on it. They're going to have low HDL, high triglycerides, and I'd be right 99 times out of 100. So the same thing that causes your cholesterol levels to do that, causes you to store weight around the midsection, causes your blood pressure to go up, causes you to have a fatty liver, and so on. So it's a syndrome. We call it metabolic syndrome. So if you see these numbers, don't panic. Just cut your carbs and sugar and eat more fat and protein. It's totally counterintuitive, I understand, but there you go. That's what it is. All right, so what predicts your risk for a second heart attack? What predicts your risk for a second heart attack? Okay, this is a study done in the Middle East maybe 10 or 12 years ago. Brilliant study where they said, let's take 8,000 middle-aged men who've had a heart attack. They looked for people who'd had a heart attack, recruited them, and they said, we want to check your bloods every year for the next 10 or 20 years and see what measurements, was it cholesterol, blood pressure, insulin, sugars, what is it that predicts your risk of a second heart attack? If you had high total cholesterol, so if your cholesterol was 9 or 11 and your doctor was freaking out, it did not predict your risk. It did not increase your risk for a second heart attack. So there you go. There's just yet another study showing it's not your total cholesterol or your LDL. If you had high bad cholesterol, it didn't increase your risk. So it made no difference whether your cholesterol was 11 or 2, your risk of having a second heart attack. If you had high blood pressure, it doubled your risk for a heart attack, predictably and understandably. If you had high insulin, and I'll explain why this or what this means, you had a 67% increased risk of having a heart attack. So if you're at, 670% increased risk. So if your risk was 10%, it was now 67. You were way up there, 670. So almost a 7-time increase, a 7-fold increase in your baseline risk. Now, why is that important? What do we know about insulin? Well, we know insulin is a hormone that keeps your blood sugar levels under control. So when your blood sugar levels are really high, you're eating a lot of processed foods, a lot of, your cereals, granola bars, chocolate, ice cream, all that sort of stuff. And your blood sugar levels are constantly high. Your insulin level has to go high to match. And when your insulin level is high, this happens. Your HDL, good cholesterol, goes down. Your triglycerides, your bad cholesterol go up. And you end up with high blood pressure, weight around the midsection, pre-diabetes eventually if you don't control it, and a vastly increased risk of heart disease. Take care of your blood sugar levels. Eat real food. Don't eat processed food. Don't be looking at calories this and diet that and skinny that. That's all nonsense marketing based on an old school way of looking at food. So the real message is this, guys. Focusing on your total cholesterol number and your LDL cholesterol, so-called bad cholesterol number. It appears from the literature very, very clear to anyone who can understand or interpret the literature. You're barking up the wrong tree. If you're saying my cholesterol is over, 5 or 6 or 7, therefore I need to lower my cholesterol, or if you're hearing that from a professional, well, the literature is showing exactly the opposite. The literature is showing that actually that's less important. What we really want to look at is having your HDL. We don't want that to be low. Your triglycerides, we don't want them to be high. We don't want to have high blood pressure, and we don't want to carry a lot of weight in the midsection. So how do we do that? Well, again, we lower that hormone, insulin. If you lower insulin, your HDL goes up every time. I see it, day in, day out when we see blood results with patients in the NHS who have cardiovascular disease, who have diabetes and so on. We have a couple of 100,000 patients under our care. So we're actually live across, we're working with 4 different primary care networks. Primary care network is 4 or 5 GP surgeries together. So we have four primary care networks that we have contracts with in the UK that we work with. So we see this all the time. If you lower your blood sugar levels by eating real food, by avoiding cereals, granola bars, bananas, potatoes, and eating much more kind of meat, eggs, vegetables that grow above the ground, strawberries, raspberries, blackberries with, Greek yogurt, cream, even as crazy as that sounds, you will lower your triglycerides. Your triglycerides will come down. And if you cut your alcohol intake, they'll go down even further. You will increase your HDL by eating those whole foods that are lower in carbs. Your blood pressure will come down and you will lose weight around the midsection. So to sum up with the diet, and this is to optimize your cholesterol levels. I hate using the term lower your cholesterol levels. People always say to me, I want to lower my cholesterol levels. And I often think you're probably asking the wrong question if you say you want to lower your cholesterol. I don't want to lower my cholesterol at all. I want to lower my triglycerides and I want to increase my HDL for sure. I'm not concerned about what my total cholesterol does. And that's what most people are referring to when they say my cholesterol. So this is what you do if you want to do that from a dietary point of view. Now, whether you decide to go on statins or cholesterol lowering medications and you want to appease someone, or you just would prefer if your cholesterol wasn't 6 and it was 4, all I would say is, because I can't make comments on medication, is just do your research. Just even look up some YouTube videos, some top cardiologists like Dr. Aseem Malhotra, Molhatra. He has Aseem, Aseem Malhotra. He has a great talk called Too Much Medicine on statins and whether they're worth the risks that come with them. And every medication that can have what we call iatrogenic or unintended side effects. And Dr. Paul Mason has a great talk called Are You Smart? Provocatively called Are You Smarter Than Your Doctor? They're worth looking up. Okay, so eat more, not less. Meat, eggs, cheese, strawberries and cream, real butter, avocado, chia seeds, dark chocolate, full fat cheeses, above ground vegetables, so not potatoes, sweet potatoes, and so on. And eat less. And that, by the way, that's referred to broadly as a low carb or ketogenic way of eating. And less breads of any description. Some people would say, yeah, but brown bread is healthy. Brown bread is healthier than white bread because it's broadly slightly higher in fiber and a little bit lower in carbs, a little bit. So you're looking at, if you want to know which is better or have some context to that kind of idea, white bread, 2 slices of white bread will leave you with about 8 spoons of sugar in your blood. 2 slices of whole grain will leave you with about 7 spoons of sugar in your blood. It varies across brand. A ham and cheese omelette will leave you with 0 spoons of sugar in your blood. Some fried cabbage with a steak and cauliflower and broccoli and a bit of butter will leave you with 0 spoons of sugar in your blood. So you can get what I'm saying there. Rice and pasta, avoid if you can, or at least minimize your consumption of. Breakfast cereals are the biggest con on the Western world. The idea that healthy, heart healthy, whole grain based on that nonsense calories in, calories out idea for the last 30, 40 years. Personally, I haven't touched, I actually can't remember the last time I had a breakfast cereal, but it was pushing 10 years ago. You can make homemade granola recipes. You can buy, although they're crazy expensive, like keto granola, like a small box and they're about a tenner. they're a waste of money, I would argue. Personally, I would just have 3 or 4 eggs in the morning, or even a few pieces of bacon or something with it. Fizzy drinks, with the exception of the kind of diet drinks, they're okay. They're not good for you. Aspartame is a well-documented carcinogenic, but in very small quantities, 1 or 2 a week, I wouldn't get too worked up over it. Starchy vegetables, avoid. So potatoes, sweet potatoes, they are, you're talking 5 to 7 spoons of sugar in your blood when you eat one. Now, will I be having potatoes with my Christmas dinner, understanding and knowing that there are 5 to 7 spoons of sugar in my blood? Damn right I will. I have too many, way too many. And Yorkshire puddings and everything that goes with it. And I'll do a session actually coming up to Christmas on how I'm going to approach it and how I'd suggest people approach it. But Christmas is not now. Christmas is not mid-February when we're still eating the Cadbury's roses that we don't even like because they're still in the tin. Christmas is a couple of days. I know it's a period, but like the peak of it is a couple of days. So I wouldn't be too worried about relaxing and loosening the belt for a couple of days. Obviously, we want to avoid things like cakes, pastries, scones, all that sort of stuff, croissants, danishes. And by the way, this idea that you'd see, I went into Costa to meet my dad last week and I saw Danish pastry and it was like glazed and had the custard, whatever, the stuff that they have on it. And it was like, only 88 calories or something like that. It's such nonsense. It means nothing. The amount of calories in something is irrelevant if it's causing you to have blood sugar levels as if you ate 18 spoons of sugar and causing all sorts of inflammation and hormonal issues going all over the place. You just ignore calories, really. Eat real food. And grain-based food, so things like granola bars. So guys, a couple of key points I suppose to take away from today's session. 1, dietary cholesterol does not adversely affect your blood serum cholesterol levels. So the cholesterol floating through your blood is not adversely or badly affected by eating more cholesterol. Point number 2 is when it comes to your cholesterol number, the literature is beyond clear. The vast majority of people don't know it, and that's the nature of being on top of the science for the last kind of 7 or 8 years that we have obsessively, or the benefit of it. HDL high, triglycerides low, you're golden in terms of your predicting cardiovascular disease. Your total number is anti-correlated, so the higher it goes, the lower your risk, and that will be news to most doctors and a lot of cardiologists actually, with the exception of the doctors and cardiologists that I've mentioned. Your best approach for optimizing your cholesterol levels, so getting your HDL up and your triglycerides down, is not to do anything with fat or meat or eggs or eat any less of those. In fact, probably eat more. If you want to get your good cholesterol up higher, you want to control your insulin level. So eat less sugar and refined carbohydrate. Breads, cereals, granola bars, rice, pasta, cakes, pastries, and basically anything that tastes nice. And I say that facetiously because I love meat and eggs and cheese and veg and all that sort of stuff. And you know what? It's amazing, but basically, you kind of need to eat a bit more like your grandparents did if you want to optimize your cholesterol levels. So I often think that my grandparents, God rest their souls, if I went back in time and said to them I was born in 1980, and if I went back and said to them, look, in the mid 80s, I know this sounds crazy, but actually that eggs and cheese and lamb, that's really bad for you. You should eat less of it. They would just burst out laughing because nobody was overweight. Broadly speaking, in the 60s, 70s, when they were eating that growing up, there was little or no heart disease. The leading cause of death just 100 years ago, that's like 1.5 people ago, was not heart disease, cancer, diabetes, none of those things. None of those things. They almost didn't exist. It was infectious diseases. And yet in a couple of generations, 1.5 generations, we're now at a point where the leading causes of death, 7 out of 10 of them are food related. Yet we stick to our guns and go, eat your whole grains and your low fat. It's crazy. Anyway, they're the key takeaways from today, guys. I really appreciate you joining. If you enjoyed the session, leave a comment, say what you liked about it, or give me a suggestion for something to cover in the coming weeks. Guys, thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. I know I rambled on for half an hour today, but I really wanted to do a bit of a deep dive and give you a couple of solid takeaways in terms of cholesterol numbers. Guys, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. It just helps us with the algorithm, even though it's a closed group only going out to our corporates. Have a good day and eat real food. Great term, I love. Eat like your life depends on it, because it does. Have a good day, and I'll see you soon, guys. Bye-bye.